So Jane, as we head into camp here, I know we'll be hanging out a lot, talking about all these storylines and things like that. But I guess the big storyline, at least nationally for a lot of people, is just it's going to be all eyes on really probably this coaching staff, Kellen Moore, Mike McCarthy. A lot of people feeling like specifically McCarthy, it's kind of a do or die year for him. What's the big news peg you think for you heading into this camp?
I think it's a big deal, the fact that it's the last year of all of these coaches' contracts. But I also think, it's been so confusing because we talk about this team heading into camp every year and the talent seems to be there, right? And you could argue that this is a really great offense, a top 5 offense in the league. This is a team that finished 12-5 last season. I think what everybody struggles with was the way they failed to compete against San Francisco. And if that game had gone differently, I think we'd be having a different conversation and probably a little bit more hope about this team heading into the season if it hadn't ended the way that it did. I think it definitely helps that you've got a healthier Dak. I know that's one of the storylines heading into every season, the healthiest I've ever been.
Yeah.
But I think it has less to do with his physical health, and I think his mental health feels better. Think about some of the stuff that he was coming off of heading into camp last season, the death of his brother, his coming back from, that gruesome ankle injury. Is it going to be okay? Is it not? And then to have, this non-football injury in his throwing shoulder, that was odd. And so I just think mentally it was hard for even Dak to feel right. And he just always seems like one of those guys that if his mind is right, everything else works out. But I think what we've seen is when he's struggling mentally, I think that's where we've seen his game struggle. So I think that's going to be one of the more underrated storylines that we're not talking about. I think it's one thing to say, I'm the healthiest I've been, but I feel like it's the healthiest mentally he's been in a long time, too.
We're talking to Jane Slater of the NFL Network on the Diamond Factory Hotline right here on 105.3 The Fan. And Jane, a lot has been made in this offseason about, after that game that you mentioned, the San Francisco game, about like toughness for this team and how it was lacking last season and maybe how this team would like to inject some toughness in this season. Like how big of a deal actually is that? And have you gotten any impressions that that's something that's front of mind for this front office and for this coaching staff?
I think, remember how much we talked about the defense heading into last season, and they were, I think, embarrassed by the product that they put on the field. Granted, that was Mike Nolan's defense, and I think Bobby and I, you and I have enough sources that we can speak to. There was a really bad roster makeup as it related to that side of the ball, and they got those things right. So I think there was a sense of pride knowing that they could turn that around. I think the continuity on defense is a big deal, and I think Dan Quinn is really, one of the things that stood out to me is when I was talking to some of the guys in minicamp OTAs, which, by the way, I just think it's so much better for the fans, and not just to say this selfishly or personally as a reporter, but for us to be able to ask these questions and get these answers. It gives us a better sense of the team when we're reporting. It allows us to give you better information. But I thought the one thing that really stood out to me in talking to some of these guys, Neville Gallimore being one of them, he said that Dan Quinn and Aiden Dirty, who he doesn't think the defensive line coach gets enough credit, is the way that they operate and the way that they carry themselves and the way they talk to these guys as men, not players, not guys that they coach, but as men, not dissimilar from the way we would often hear Ron Marinelli. These guys want to play for them. It was Neville Gallimore saying that he wanted to be as good as Aiden at anticipating certain plays and anticipating coverages. And in fact, he wanted to be as good in the film room as some of these guys. And so I think it's the way that they're leading by example that's rubbing off on these players. And so I think defensively, the mindset's there. I don't hear enough about that on the offensive side of the ball. And to be fair, I don't think I've asked that question perhaps enough. So I don't want to say that's not happening on the offensive side of the ball, but I just feel like that information is volunteered so freely by defensive players without even having to ask it or prompt them about the coaching staff and really sort of the way they've got a touch point with that side of the ball. And so that's maybe a question I'll actually bring up during camp. And I know that these guys have spoken highly as Mike McCarthy. And I do think, too, and Mike will admit this to you, and we have these conversations with him at Combine, and I've had some conversations with Mike in the offseason. I really think there was a disconnect because of the Zoom calls and trying to implement a new system and change things the way that they did and get guys on the same page. He just was an old dog that didn't necessarily feel comfortable enough with that new trick. And I think we sort of, at least I did as a reporter, in his first year, we'll go, well, what about Kevin Stefanski? Look what he did with the Cleveland Browns in his first season. Why can't Mike do that? I have noticed that it feels like there's a better understanding. There's a little bit more chemistry with these guys. I think the big questions that are going to pop up is, canceling, mini camp early and giving these guys some of the time off. And, is that going to play out negatively? Now, I'll tell you, if you want to point fingers, I mean, don't forget it was Sean Payton who didn't even think that they needed OTAs during COVID or so, remember? So, I mean, different coaches have different tactics. So I don't think that it would be fair to sit here and say, well, Mike McCarthy is doing something so radically different. It feels like, when I talked to somebody in Green Bay, one of his former players, he said the one thing that the players loved the most about Mike was that he had a very good feel for their bodies. In other words, prolonging the health of these players. And players are always going to respect coaches that do that for them. So maybe there's a psychology in what he's doing there. In other words, I'm a player's coach. I'm looking out for your body. We're getting enough of this stuff done. I feel good enough about it. Now we'll start implementing it at camp. I mean, that's really what mini camp and OTAs are all about. Get the system, start implementing it when you get to camp. So I just, I don't know if we've got a big enough or good enough sample size on Mike based on some of the things that have happened in the last couple of years. But yeah, I mean, I do think there's going to be a lot of eyeballs on Mike, and there's not a lot of excuses left for this coaching staff. And quite frankly, for Kellen Moore, even for Dak, unfortunately, I think there's still a lot of question marks about Dak. And, Bobby, you and I feel a type of way about Dak, and we typically present the numbers and the stats, and here's why we think he is what he is. But I still think the national narrative about Dak is one that he's still fighting to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's one that even locally for some people that he's still fighting to change that. There's a lot of questions about him, and specifically just because how he had played in the second half of the season. I think it's interesting when you mentioned that he seems to be better in a mental space than he's been in a long time. I think that as much as the physical stuff, I do think the calf was probably bothering him in the second half of the year, but I think as much as the physical stuff, there was this issue of, man, he hurt he broke the leg, he hurt the shoulder, then it was, straining the calf, and it's like 3 pretty significant injuries over the course of 10 weeks of time on the field. I think that he got a little concerned about his own fragility and I can't get hurt again. We're down the stretch. I can't get hurt. And I think that as much as anything was part of the issue in the second half of the season was it felt like he was in his head a little bit. And I think that he's more clear-minded coming out of this offseason.
And look, that's real. And this is not an apples to orange comparison, but think about how durable he was and fairly injury-free prior to being a starter. Remember, we talked about every job that he had earned because the starter had an injury, right? And he was, he didn't have any problems with missing games until, really that season 2 years ago when, he had the gruesome ankle injury. And I think to your point, he's not dissimilar from some of us that were like, this is our year, right? Like mentally you've got your head right. I'm feeling good. And then it's like one thing after another knocks you down. And there's going to be people listening to saying, well, look, you get paid X amount of money. You should be more mentally tough than that. These players these days are so soft, whatever. But I think we've all done that in our careers. I've certainly had seasons where I say to myself, this is going to be a great year. And Bobby, you and I have been long enough, that. I'm like, this is going to be a great year. I'm going to put out my best stuff yet. And it's like, then these things happen and they get in your head. And then you find yourself going, can we hit the reset button and get to the next season? And I know that's not the way you're going to look at it. This is year 7 for him. Even he said at minicamp and OTAs, he found himself, thinking it was only year 6. And it was Zeke who reminded him, nope, it's year 7.
Yeah.
And he said, maybe I had just blocked out that one season. And so I think with all that being said, he's doing the things he's got to do to get himself ready. I think some big question marks really on that offense are, how are you going to use the running backs? It was Zeke who told me that, you and I had speculated about this too last season, Bobby. What was up with Zeke? And he had told me it was an ACL injury that was really slowing him down. It happened after the Carolina game, and I was actually just going back to the video earlier today because I'm on NFL Network talking, and it was, I think, right after the Raiders game, he said he had re-aggravated it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we were seeing some of that into play. You saw the offensive line who had constant rotation because of injuries. And then this year, I don't know if we have any answers to those questions, right? Like, how healthy is Zeke going to be? Are they going to use Tony Pollard more? We've talked about Simi Fioco and a little bit of position flex for him there. And is Dalton Schultz going to feel a type of way because he didn't get the franchise tag? Although I think, but long-term deal, although I don't think a lot of us were necessarily shocked by that.
Right.
The wide receiver crew, I think there are a lot of questions about CD. Is he mentally tough enough to take on that number one role and then not have a guy like Michael Gallup back you up at number two? Is Jalen Tolbert, James White?
Yeah.
I just think there's still a lot of questions as it relates to the offense, and this is where Kellen Moore is going to have to prove himself as being that guy.
That's James Slater.
And by the way, Mike McCarthy has talked about us how he might find himself getting a little bit more involved in offense. So that's
we'll see, Jane. Jane, we will see if he actually decides to get involved. But I'll say that. You don't have to. I will say that though, Jane.
I mean, if you're fighting for another contract, wouldn't you?
I would, Jane. I'm just saying that we'd be breaking some history, I think, here. That's all.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be new for him. He's very well versed in the picking up of play calling responsibilities. He is. I'm just saying. All right, Jane. I'll be positive. I promise. I'm going to be positive going into Oxnard. I'm not going to bring this down. I'm not going to be negative, Nancy.
It doesn't even have to be him taking the call sheet away and start calling the play. It could just be, I'm choosing to be much more collaborative than I have in years past. He had spoken to us at Combine about the fact that he found in his coaching career at Green Bay that he was almost doing too much, and he found that you need to delegate a little bit more. And I will tell you, as a control freak, I have tried to allow people, and you know this, Bobby, more than anyone, it takes me even a long time in my day-to-day job to trust that certain people that I work with are going to get the job done because you're so used to doing it your way, right? But It's nice when you can find that collaboration. That's why you and I work so well at NFL Network together, is because I inherently trust you when I'm like, hey, I need you to go pull this stat, or, help me with this, or if I'm about to go on air, I'm like, hey, real quick, Bobby, and of course you're my rainmaker. It's like I wasn't able to trust that many people before you, and before I was always doing everything by myself. And so it takes time to develop that sort of relationship. And again, it's not apples to oranges, or here's my example versus theirs, and just trying to get the basic psychology of what's going on and trying to have a better understanding for the dynamics over there. I wonder if he took that hands-off approach to give Kellen the best possible opportunity to get this right. And then he's found himself, and probably in conversations with Jerry and Steven, maybe you need to be a little bit more collaborative, and maybe that's what we see this year. I don't see him taking away the call sheet, although I did ask him that point blank. Did you ever consider that? Yes, you got towards the end of the San Francisco game. You had just as much opportunity there to not call a quarterback draw, right? So, you always wish you could do things differently, but it feels better around there. I don't know if it's different, but it feels better just at minicamp and OTAs, and just feeling like I think all of us felt maybe things are getting back to normal. And they certainly have a wide open division. I mean, if you're gonna make some waves, this is your year to do it, Mike. Because I just don't know if I have a lot of confidence in the Giants being able to turn around as quickly as they have. Although I think Brian Daboll is such a coup for the Giants. And then I guess maybe you can look at the Eagles. Washington, I don't see them being an issue, but I do think you kind of got to look at Philly. But I think the Cowboys, division's wide open for them.